widow with nothing left, said, "I don't deserve love." The cowboy answered, "You deserve me." Dust Hollow, Colorado, winter of 1884. The stagecoach groaned to a halt just as the last light of day dipped behind the hills. The wind cut through the dusty main street like a blade, scattering straw and snowflakes across shuttered storefronts. Janice Winslow stepped down with trembling legs, her threadbare skirt brushing the frozen ground. In her arms, 3-year-old Annie clung tightly, eyes wide beneath a knitted cap that no longer fit. The driver gave a nod, tossed her worn satchel down, and climbed back into his seat. The stage rumbled away, leaving only silence behind. Janice glanced around. Dust Hollow looked nothing like the place she remembered from years ago, when she had passed through as a newlywed, hopeful and proud. Now, it was just another stop in her long road of rejection. Her fingers curled tighter around Annie's. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "We'll find someone." Their boots crunched toward a modest house near the blacksmith's. Janice knocked twice. The door opened just enough for a pale face to appear. The woman on the other side raised an eyebrow. "Janice? It's me." Janice swallowed. "We need a place for the night." The woman's mouth pressed into a line. "You brought that child here? After what your husband did?" "He's dead. I have nowhere else to go. Please, just one night." The woman opened the door wider, then slammed it shut without another word. Through the window, Janice could see her draw the curtain. She turned away, Annie beginning to whimper. "Mama, I'm cold." "I know, sweetheart. I know." They walked aimlessly until Janice spotted the old water pump near the church. She sank down beside it, pulled Annie into her lap, and wrapped them both in her shawl. Her hands were numb. Her lips trembled as she looked up at the cloud-heavy sky. Every door had closed on them. Every name she had once trusted had turned away, all because Harold Winslow had gambled their lives into ruin and died with more debts than dignity. Even his family had cast her out. She was 24, widowed, penniless, and alone in a town that wanted nothing from her. She bit her lip to stop the tears. Then a voice broke the quiet. No one should be left out in the cold like that. Least of all, a child. Janice looked up sharply. A tall man stood in the shadows near the hitching post, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow across sharp cheekbones. His coat was dusted with snow, his gloved hands steady as he watched them. His eyes, gray, calm, unreadable, met hers. "I don't want charity," Janice said quickly, lifting her chin. "We'll be gone by morning." He stepped forward slowly. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering shelter." Janice stared. "Why?" The man removed his hat. His voice was low. "Name's Garrett Calloway. I own the Calloway Ranch up north." She blinked. The name was familiar. A man known for keeping to himself. A man who hadn't been seen much in town since his fiancée's suicide nearly a decade ago. Rumors swirled about him, some cruel, some tragic. He had built a ranch with his bare hands and never taken a wife. "Why would you help me?" she asked. He glanced at Annie, who had nestled into her coat, eyes heavy with sleep. Garrett's jaw tightened. "Because no child should sleep on frozen ground, and because I've seen too many people pretend not to see." Janice didn't speak. He nodded toward the edge of town. "I've got a cabin near the ridge. It's not much, but it's warm. You can work for your keep, if you want it." Janice looked down at her daughter, then back at the stranger. He didn't smile. He didn't move. But something in his eyes said she was not alone anymore. She stood slowly. "All right." Garrett turned and began walking. Janice followed, Annie sleeping against her chest. Behind them, Dust Hollow's lamps flickered to life. Ahead, the cold wind whispered across the prairie. Janice took one last look at the town that had turned its back, and kept walking toward the only man who hadn't. The snow crunched underfoot as Garrett led the way up a narrow, winding path. Janice followed close behind, Annie sleeping in her arms, her breath forming faint clouds in the freezing air. Far from town, the ranch sprawled like a sleeping beast across the foothills, wooden fences, smoke curling from distant chimneys, and lights flickering like stars scattered on the earth. They reached a cabin nestled against a grove of pine trees. It was small, made of weathered logs and stone, but it stood firm against the wind. A single lantern glowed in the window. Garrett unlocked the door, then stepped aside. "It's not much," he said, "but it's dry and warm." Janice stepped in cautiously. The cabin smelled of cedar and ash. A fire crackled in the hearth. There was a narrow bed against the wall, a table, 2 chairs, and a small stove with a kettle already warming. A stack of folded blankets rested on the trunk at the foot of the bed. "I use this place during roundup season," Garrett added. "No one's been here since fall." Janice gently laid Annie on the bed, covering her with a quilt. The child didn't stir. Garrett leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You can stay here. In return, help out where you can. We've got 15 hands on the ranch. Meals, laundry, odds and ends. Nothing fancy." Janice met his gaze. "I can work." He nodded once. "Good." Then he turned and left without another word. By morning, the snow had stopped. Janice woke to find a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in cloth on the table and a small jar of honey beside it. No note, no sign of Garrett. Only faint boot prints in the snow outside. She dressed Annie, bundled herself in her worn cloak, and made her way to the cookhouse at the edge of the ranch. The air smelled of bacon and coffee. Inside, a gruff man with flour on his shirt handed her a stack of linens and nodded toward a wash basin. No introductions were needed. Everyone knew why she was there. That day, she scrubbed clothes until her fingers went raw, chopped vegetables until her shoulders ached, and swept floors while Annie played nearby in the straw. No one said much. Some men offered polite nods. Others kept their distance. Janice didn't blame them, but she noticed Garrett once, at a distance, speaking to the foreman near the stables. He glanced her way briefly, then turned away. Over the following days, the pattern settled. Garrett never lingered. He arrived at dawn, fed the horses, checked the fencing, and was gone before Janice could say a word. He returned at dusk, eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, nodding politely if they crossed paths. But Janice noticed small things. The cloak she had draped over a chair one night, its torn seam stitched neatly by morning. The wooden spoon, with a split handle, replaced without mention. And Annie, who named every foal in the paddock and called them her herd, always found a new apple in her pocket after visiting the barn. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Janice found a basket by the door, filled with firewood already chopped to size. A single wool scarf lay on top. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She didn't need to ask who had left it. That night, as Annie slept curled beside her, Janice sat by the fire, holding the scarf in her lap. It was thick, hand-knit, coarse but warm. She stared into the flames and whispered, "Why are you being kind to us?" The fire offered no answer. But somehow, the silence felt less empty now. Morning light spilled through the slats of the barn, casting soft gold across the hay-strewn floor. The smell of horses, leather, and fresh straw filled the air. Janice stood just inside the entrance, her hands full of folded towels meant for the stables, but the sight before her made her stop cold. Garrett sat on a bale of hay, one leg bent, the other stretched out, with Annie curled in his lap like a sleeping kitten. Her head rested against his chest, her thumb still in her mouth, one fist tangled in the fabric of his coat. Garrett was speaking softly, his voice low and rough like gravel polished smooth. "She was a skittish little thing," he said, running his hand gently along Annie's back. "Jet black, but with a white star on her head. Wouldn't let anyone near her for weeks. Then one day she let me put a hand on her muzzle. That was it. She picked me." Janice didn't think he saw her. His gaze was far away, somewhere back in time, but the smile on his face was unmistakable, small, lopsided, and real. It was the first time she'd seen him smile like that. Her breath caught. Later that evening, back in the cabin, Janice noticed the rocking chair had been moved. It now sat near the hearth, angled perfectly to catch the fire's warmth. Annie's doll, one Garrett had carved himself from pine and stained with what little ink he could find, was tucked neatly on the bed beside her pillow. Janice examined it. The little toy had eyes, a smile, and a carved braid just like Annie's. The tiny hands even held a pretend lasso. In the corner of the room, her old boots rested on a mat. She reached for them absently and paused. The soles, once split at the seams, had been expertly stitched and reinforced. The worn leather shone faintly with fresh oil. He had fixed them, quietly, without thanks or notice. Days passed, and the signs continued. A mug left warming on the stove, a broken cupboard hinge repaired, extra firewood stacked before the snow fell. One evening, after Annie had drifted to sleep and the cabin glowed in the hush of firelight, Janice found the courage to ask. She stood by the table, clutching the mug he'd just poured her, watching as he pulled on his coat by the door. "Why do you keep helping me?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the wind outside. Garrett didn't turn around. "Because you need it." "That's not what I meant," her voice wavered. "I see what you do, for Annie, for me." He stood silent for a moment, then finally looked over his shoulder. "I'm not doing anything special," he said flatly. "I just don't want to find a child frozen to death in the morning. That's all." The words hit like a slap. Janice stared at him, her fingers tightening around the mug. "So that's it? Pity?" Garrett's eyes flickered. "You're reading too much into things, Mrs. Winslow." She felt her cheeks flush hot, a mix of shame and confusion. "Right, of course." He said nothing more, just opened the door and stepped into the cold. Janice sat down slowly at the table, her hands trembling. She had not expected declarations, not from him, but something in her had hoped for warmth beneath the silence, something deeper behind the kindness. Instead, he had shut the door between them with a few cold words. Yet even through the sting, she could not forget what she had seen that morning, the way he'd held her child, told her stories, smiled like a man who had not smiled in years. He may have pushed her away, but Janice knew. No man did all this out of obligation, not for a child that wasn't his. The wind howled outside the small hunting cabin, rattling the shutters like a restless spirit. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a soft orange glow across the wooden walls. Janice stirred in her sleep, the wool blanket slipping from her shoulder. Then she heard it, the low, aching strum of a guitar. It was distant, yet clear, like a heartbeat beneath the silence. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Annie, and pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped into her boots. She followed the sound across the snow-covered yard to the barn. The door was cracked just enough to let the music spill out. Inside, Garrett sat on a hay bale, hunched over a dusty guitar. His fingers moved with practiced ease, plucking a tune so sorrowful it wrapped around the beams like a memory that refused to die. His eyes were fixed on the floor, jaw set, brows drawn. The song was wordless, but it spoke of loss, of time that would not heal. Janice stood in the shadows and said nothing. When the last note faded, Garrett didn't look up. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She stepped forward slowly. "I heard the music." He gave a slight nod, resting the guitar on his knee. "Used to play for someone. A long time ago." Janice waited. After a pause, he spoke again. "Her name was Eliza. We were set to marry. Summer of '79. Janice sat on a nearby stool, her hands folded in her lap. "She had a laugh like creek water in spring," he continued, his voice far away. "But something inside her, it wasn't steady. She hid it well at first. I didn't see the cracks until they broke her." He looked down at the strings. She took her life 4 days before the wedding, in her father's orchard. Janice's breath caught, but she stayed silent. They blamed me, said I pushed her too hard, didn't see her struggle. Maybe they were right, maybe I should have known, but I didn't. He leaned back, his face weary. I left everything, my parents' farm, my brother's business, bought land no one wanted, rocky, dry, too far from the river, built this place up by sheer stubbornness. He looked at her then, eyes dark and tired. Been alone ever since. Janice's heart ached. She had known there was pain behind his silence, but not this kind, not the kind that gutted a man from the inside out. I'm sorry, she whispered. He shook his head. Don't be. The barn creaked in the wind. You should leave, Janice, he said suddenly. She blinked. What? When the snow melts, you and the girl find someplace better, safer. She swallowed hard. Why? Because I can't do this again, Garrett said, standing. I can't carry anyone else. I tried once. I failed. That was enough. Janice felt the words like stones in her chest. But she didn't argue. She stood slowly. All right. Their eyes met. For a moment, something flickered between them. Regret, maybe, or something softer neither dared name. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin alone. She did not cry until the door closed behind her. Dust Hollow had always been a town of whispers. But that winter, the whispers sharpened into knives. It began when Vern Greeley rode back into town. He was a tall man, thin as fencing wire and twice as mean, with a long scar down his jaw that never quite healed right. Years ago, he'd tried to buy Garrett Calloway's ranch for pennies, knowing the North Ridge would one day hold the railroad line. Garrett refused. Vern never forgot the humiliation. When he saw Janice in town buying flour with borrowed coins and Garrett's horse tied outside, Vern's eyes narrowed like a coyote scenting weakness. So that is the woman, he muttered to himself. And by sundown, the rumors began. She is a widow who drags bad luck behind her. Her husband gambled himself to death. She carries the stain. Wherever she goes, trouble follows. Garrett Calloway is next. The lies slid through Dust Hollow like smoke through a vent. By the time Janice walked into the general store again, even the bell above the door sounded unfriendly. Mrs. Denton, the owner, stiffened behind the counter. We're closed, she snapped. Janice blinked. It's the middle of the day. Closed to you. Her cheeks flushed. I have money. You have trouble, the woman replied coldly. And I won't have you cursing my business. A man by the barrel of oats muttered loud enough for all to hear. Should run her out like they did in Pine Rock. Janice froze. Please, she whispered. I'm only trying to buy bread. Then bake it yourself. You will get nothing here. She left without a word, holding Annie close so the child wouldn't hear her mother's trembling breath. But the cruelty didn't end there. 2 days later, while Janice scrubbed laundry behind the cabin, she heard Annie crying. She ran toward the sound and found her daughter near the ranch well, face blotched red, tears streaming, a small stone lying near her feet. A boy from town stood on the edge of the fence, glaring. My mama says you're cursed, he shouted. You shouldn't be here. Janice gathered Annie into her arms. Go home, she said firmly, voice breaking. Before I tell your parents myself. The boy spat at the snow and ran. That night, Janice sat by the small fire, arms wrapped around Annie, her heart in splinters. She didn't tell Garrett. She didn't want to cause trouble. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to be the reason he fought anyone. But word travels fast when it's rotting. By morning, Garrett heard everything, from the storekeeper's refusal to the stone thrown at Annie. When he saddled his horse, the ranch hands exchanged a look and silently stepped out of his way. They had seen that look once before, years ago, when a man insulted his late fiancée. The outcome was not gentle. Garrett rode into Dust Hollow with the storm in his eyes. He stopped first at the general store. The door banged open so hard the hinges rattled. Mrs. Denton gasped. Mr. Calloway, why did you refuse service to the woman under my protection?" His voice was low, dangerous. The woman stammered. "She brings misfortune, people say. She." He stepped forward. "People say many foolish things," he growled, "and I will not hear her name used like a curse in this town." Then he went to the saloon, where Vern Greeley played cards with two ranch hands. Before Vern could rise, Garrett grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall hard enough to rattle glasses. "You think you can spread lies," Garrett hissed, "and hide behind shadows." Vern coughed, smirking weakly. "A man is free to speak what he believes." Garrett leaned in so close, only Vern could hear the next words. "Speak anything you want about me, but if you ever speak her name again, I will bury you so deep in this valley, not even the wind will find you." The saloon fell silent. Garrett released him with a shove and walked out without a backward glance. That night, Janice heard footsteps outside the cabin. She opened the door to find a burlap sack neatly placed on the porch. Inside was a thick wool sweater for her, a bottle of salve, wrapped carefully, for Annie's bruised cheek, and one small envelope. Her hands shook as she opened it. Garrett's handwriting was rough, uneven, as if he struggled with every word. "I am not good with speeches, but I will not let anyone harm you or your child. Not now, not ever." Janice pressed the note to her chest. For the first time since the whispers began, she let herself cry, not out of fear, but because someone, somewhere, had chosen to fight for her. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Janice continued her chores around the cabin, but the spark in her eyes had dulled. The incident in town had left more than just bruises. It had shaken her resolve, and though Garrett's gesture had meant more than she could say, it only deepened the ache in her chest. She couldn't stay. Not when the town turned its back. Not when every kindness Garrett showed only made the goodbye harder. On a cold morning, with frost on the windows and Annie bundled tightly in her arms, Janice stood by the porch as Garrett approached on horseback. His expression was unreadable. "I want to thank you," she said, before he could speak, "for everything, truly." He didn't dismount, just looked at her, the lines on his face sharp as ever. "I won't be a burden to you," she continued. "You've done enough." "You're not," he said flatly. "But I am," she replied softly. She met his eyes, hoping for something, anything that would stop her. A word, a look, a reason. But he only gave a short nod. "Then go," he said, "before the snow gets worse." And just like that, it was over. Janice didn't cry until they were out of sight of the ranch. She and Annie set off toward the nearest rest stop, an old mail station a few miles out, where she hoped to find temporary work. The trail was half frozen, the sky already heavy with clouds. By the end of the second day, snow began to fall. It started as flurries, gentle and white. Then the wind howled, and the world turned gray. The storm rolled in fast. Inside the shelter of a broken wagon along the trail, Janice huddled with Annie, wrapped in both their coats. Their firewood was gone. The last biscuit had been eaten. Annie whimpered in her sleep, and Janice could barely feel her fingers. She whispered lullabies into the child's ear, her voice shaking. "Just a little longer, baby," she murmured. "Mama's here." Back at the ranch, Garrett stood on the porch, staring out at the snow-covered hills. The storm had cut off the northern trail. He hadn't slept in days. Mrs. Pritchard, the cook, approached with a worried look. She should have sent word by now. Garrett didn't answer, but something cracked open in his chest, something sharp and unmistakable. He threw on his coat, mounted his horse, and disappeared into the storm. The cold bit into his skin, the snow blinding, but he rode like a man possessed. He checked the trail markers, followed faint wagon ruts, shouted their names into the white silence. Hours passed. At last, near a bend in the valley, he saw a broken wagon half buried in snow. He jumped down. "Janice!" he yelled, yanking the door open. Inside, it was silent. Then, a cough. Weak. Barely there. She was curled on the floor, holding Annie tight, both barely conscious. "Janice!" he breathed, kneeling beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Garrett?" she whispered. "I'm here," he said, wrapping his coat around her, checking Annie's pulse, lifting them both into his arms. "I've got you." She swayed against him, eyes closing again. "Why?" she murmured. He held her close, his voice thick. "I already lost one person," he whispered, pressing his forehead to hers. "I will not lose another." And with that, he carried her out of the wagon, into the blizzard, toward the horse that waited. Back toward life, toward home. The storm passed, leaving the land blanketed in thick white silence. Janice and Annie remained under Garrett's roof for days afterward, both recovering from the cold. The fever broke quickly, but the fear lingered. Garrett never strayed far from the cabin, often found sitting by the hearth, sharpening tools or mending tack, casting quiet glances toward the bed where mother and child rested. On the 5th day, when Janice could finally stand without dizziness, Garrett asked her to dress warmly. "We're going into town," he said, his tone unreadable. Janice hesitated. "Why?" "You'll see." The ride into Dust Hollow was uneventful, the snow crunching under the wagon wheels. Garrett said little, his jaw tight, eyes forward. Janice sat beside him, her hands wrapped around Annie's small fingers. When they arrived, Garrett didn't head for the general store or the livery. He pulled the wagon up to the land office. "Come inside," he said, hopping down and offering her a hand. Inside, the clerk looked up in surprise, but Garrett's presence silenced any questions. Papers were drawn, names written, and documents signed. Janice watched it all in confusion, until Garrett finally turned to her, the deed in his hand. "It's yours now," he said simply. "The north paddock and the small stable beside it, legal and binding." Janice stared at him, stunned. "But why?" Garrett's voice was quiet. "Because you need a reason to stay, and I need a reason to keep going." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Later, outside the office, Garrett handed her a small box. It was worn, the leather faded. Inside lay a simple silver ring, the metal dulled by time. "This was Eliza's," he said, not meeting her eyes. Janice's breath caught. "I've held on to it for years," he continued, "not because I believed in ghosts, just because I didn't know what else to do with it." He finally looked at her, his voice steady but low. "If she were still here, I believe she would want you to have it." Janice blinked back tears. "Garrett." "No," he said gently, "you don't owe me anything. But if that ring fits your hand, then maybe it's time for all of us to begin again." Word spread quickly through Dust Hollow. Garrett Calloway, the reclusive rancher who hadn't stepped into town for more than supplies, had just signed over part of his land to the woman folks had whispered about for weeks. But this time, no one dared speak ill. Even the gruff storekeeper, who once refused Janice service, tipped his hat when he passed her on the street. Mrs. Ellery, the widow who ran the schoolhouse, sent over a basket of preserves and warm bread. Garrett didn't say a word about it. He simply returned to work, as he always did. But from that day on, people looked at him differently, not as the haunted man who rode alone at dawn, but as someone who had chosen to protect instead of disappear. And for the first time in years, Garrett didn't flinch from their gaze. He only watched Janice and Annie as they walked beside him, two lives he had once feared to care for. Now, he could no longer imagine his world without them. A year had passed since the storm, and life in Dust Hollow had shifted in small, beautiful ways. On the northern side of Garrett's ranch, where once only scrub and silence stood, a stable now rang with laughter and soft whinnies. Janice had turned the old paddock into a place of healing, not for horses alone, but for children. With Annie's innocent idea at heart, they named it Annie's Meadow. Children with twisted limbs, quiet mouths, or distant eyes came from towns near and far to brush, ride, and care for the gentle creatures under Janice's watchful gaze. Garrett built the rails higher, smoothed the paths, and hand-picked the horses for their patience. He also began offering riding lessons to the mountain children, teaching them how to trust their balance and the animal beneath them. It wasn't about mastery. It was about confidence, something he understood far too well. Together, they worked, laughed, and mended. And then came the wedding. The town hadn't seen such a gathering in years. Folks from 5 valleys showed up, some out of curiosity, others out of gratitude. Garrett had never invited attention, but this wasn't about him alone anymore. It was about what Dust Hollow had witnessed. A man once silent finding his voice, and a woman once shunned finding her home. The wedding was held in a meadow of wildflowers just east of the stable. There was no altar, just a wide blue sky and rows of hay bales for seating. Garrett wore a plain gray vest, and the same boots he wore to herd cattle. Janice's dress was hand-stitched from a curtain Mrs. Ellery had donated, a delicate white with faded rose embroidery. Annie wore ribbons in her hair and carried a basket of dried lavender. When it came time to exchange rings, Annie stepped forward with steady hands. In one palm, the silver ring from Eliza, in the other, a new band, plain, forged by Garrett's own hands from an old horseshoe. The guests hushed. Garrett took Janice's hands in his, voice clear, low, and steady. "You once said you didn't deserve love," he began. "But love doesn't choose who is worthy. It doesn't wait until we're perfect. It comes for the broken, the frightened, the ones who believe they've lost everything." He paused, searching her eyes. "You don't deserve love, Janice Winslow. You deserve me." A hush fell over the meadow, broken only by Annie's small gasp and Mrs. Abernathy's sniffles in the front row. Tears rolled down Janice's cheeks, but her smile never wavered. When the rings were slipped on, and the kiss shared, Dust Hollow erupted in applause, boots stomping the grass, hats tossed high. The sky turned gold with dusk, and music rose from fiddles and laughter alike. That night, under the stars, Janice stood with Garrett's arm around her waist, Annie dancing barefoot by the fire. She looked at the flames, then at the man beside her, and said softly, "I never thought I'd have a day like this." Garrett kissed her temple. "It's only the first of many." And as the fire crackled, Janice whispered to herself, more a vow than a memory, "I'm no longer a widow with nothing left. I'm a woman who is loved, not for what I've lost, but for what I've found." If this story touched your heart, if you found yourself rooting for Janice, smiling at Garrett's quiet strength, or tearing up when Annie carried the rings, don't let the journey end here. Tap that hype button to show your love for stories of resilience, redemption, and romance under the wild western sky. And if you want more heartfelt tales of grit and grace, of cowboys with bruised hearts and women who rise from ashes, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Because out here, every scar has a story, and every story deserves to be told.